the Chief Economist for the Asian Development Bank, Mr. Albert Park, Dean Sonobe, Vice Chancellor of the University of the South Pacific, Professor Pal Alwalia, Permanent Secretary for Finance, Shri Gounder, my teacher and long-time guru, Professor Wadan Narsi. Welcome, Wadan. Thank you for coming over. Distinguished guests, friends, ladies and gentlemen. It is great to be here today amongst all of you. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the Asian Development Bank, the University of the South Pacific, the Asian Development Bank Think Tanks Network, and all of you for being here this morning. I think this is a very timely forum, and this forum is timely because Fiji and the countries of the Blue Pacific are beginning to show their restlessness at the pace of reform of the global financial architecture, of which ADB is a part. This forum is also timely because as I speak, our Honorable Prime Minister joins his fellow Pacific and small island leaders at the United Nations General Assembly in New York and will be traveling to Washington, D.C. this week for a summit with the President of the United States of America. The Honorable Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka says that the global financial system does not work for small island states. We find ourselves at an inflection point. The world, we hope, will find the courage and political will to fundamentally reform the global financial architecture so that it is fit for purpose for these times. And if the world continues to muddle through as it has done for decades, it will deny small island states the opportunity and the openings that we are so justly seeking right now. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a difficult and uncertain global environment. The once-in-a-100-year pandemic-induced economic catastrophe has wiped off decades of our development progress. And we know in some sense the pandemic is not behind us, as we are now living in a world that is being changed by global warming. New pandemics could still lie ahead. And it is more than likely that new pandemics could also be worse than what we had. All the countries suffered massively from the COVID pandemic. But without doubt, the impact on the small island states have been the deepest. And sadly, the long-term scars of the pandemic most enduring. We all know that small states do not have the fiscal weapons that large and OECD states had to fund their social and health response and their recovery. We cannot, or we could not print money as the UK and other countries did. Some of the small island states do not have national currencies. And so this option was plainly not available to them. As a result, our debt situation, which in many cases was already bad, has worsened, especially in our case here in Fiji. Many countries have entered an uncharted debt trajectory with high levels of debt. We will need global solidarity and a political will to take fundamental new look at debt restructuring. But at the same time, we are welcoming of new approaches for debt treatment, such as debt for nature swaps. Debt restructuring cannot be kicked into the long grass and ignored any longer. That is why Fiji lends its full support to the Bridgetown Initiative And I look forward to having more discussions at the upcoming annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank in Morocco. Geopolitical tensions are on the rise. Global peace is at risk. And we see major global powers locked in a geostrategic competition. And this is sometimes hugely unsettling for us across the Pacific. Fiji and other Pacific nations find themselves on the front lines of this geopolitical contestation. And this contestation will have long-term consequences for the region. And there are no win-win options on the road ahead. None. And in fact, there will only be hard choices. The global geopolitical competition or geostrategic competition is in some way shaking the global order. The emerging economies are rethinking their approach to globalization. We are seeing supply chains being remodeled along the geostrategic lines. As a result, industries are not able to choose economically efficient production bases. More and more countries are economically adopting, different strategies. And many of them are looking inwards to promote self-reliance, even if this comes at a higher economic cost. Resources are being diverted to promote strategic interests, which otherwise would have been deployed towards fighting socio-economic challenges. In many ways, this global environment is not dissimilar, in my view, to the period leading up to the Second World War. As a result of these trends and a result of new conflicts such as Russia war on Ukraine, we are seeing increases in commodity prices and a rising cost of living. The traditional levers available to policymakers no longer work in such a politically charged global context. We have failed to see substantial actions being taken towards reducing greenhouse gases and decisively fighting the existential threat from climate change. A temperature rise beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius will have the deepest and gravest impact on the Pacific. In fact, some estimates suggest that even 1.5 Celsius temperature rise, Pacific Island economies tend to lose 40 to 80% of their land-based economies. And this 1.5 Celsius goal may be breached as early as 2030. In fact, it is quite disappointing that the UN General Assembly failed to make progress on the loss and damage facility. If the Pacific Island states did not have to borrow to recover from climate catastrophes, we could at least stand still. But the brutal truth is that whether it is Tonga or Vanuatu or any other Pacific nation, each climate catastrophe leads to increased debt. Recovery from each climate catastrophe comes at the price of progress on our SDGs. And in fact, we are now making the argument internationally that all climate finance windows must have a dedicated small island states window. From the Green Climate Fund to across climate windows within the ADB and the World Bank. The time for small island development states specific financing windows has actually come, and we need substantial progress on this. Friends, we are seeking support for new approaches to funding recovery by repositioning low-cost finance needed for recovery, by expanding parametric insurance coverage. This is good in and of itself. This will also enable us to work towards meeting the SDGs. In fact, as a region, we are falling behind in meeting our SDG targets. Last week, my Assistant Minister, Honorable Emmanuel, briefed the UN SDG Summit. With only 7 years remaining before 2030, he called on the world to take an urgent recalibration and to step up the efforts required to get the SDGs within reach. We are now in overtime zone. Multilateralism and global cooperation have to be protected. We will forge solutions together, not alone. But to get there, in fact, both China, US, and other countries like India need to be on the same table, not at different tables in different rooms. And we small island states are called by history to play our part in getting the superpowers of our era to cooperate. We must not underestimate the strength of the solidarity of the Pacific region as a whole. And we cannot allow our solidarity to be undermined as is being done in some sense at the moment. We will be worse off if this were to happen in the region. The multilateral architecture, which was born and designed almost 7 decades ago, in my view, has to be fundamentally transformed. And we are advocating this in international forums. We in Fiji find that the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank to be a fundamental part of our development story. But in the medium term, the current arrangements for development financing to Fiji and other island states of the Pacific cannot continue in this form. And in fact, if I may say so, a transformational and not incremental reform is needed. Transformational in scope, transformational in ambition, and transformational in development impact. In fact, the ADB and the World Bank, and Professor Vadanarthi, I'm sure, has written about this before, were not designed with the small island states in mind. Indeed, they were designed in an era where the largest developing countries such as India, Indonesia, Nigeria were regaining their freedom, and it was decades before small island states would follow suit. And I've often said that the international system is actually light years away from understanding the depth of disadvantages that the small island states face in the development system. There are many challenges emanating from our geographical location, distance to and from major markets, small population sizes, lack of access to technology, cost of finance, cost competitiveness, actually impose huge constraints on our development aspirations, and I think all of you understand this. And let me just give you 2 examples to illustrate this. For example, if Indonesia were to borrow to build and upgrade 50 kilometers of its roads, it may, for example, cost Indonesia, say, $100 million. Indonesia will not need to import most of the raw materials. It has a competitive road construction sector and it has capacity. But if Solomon Islands were to build the same length of road, it may cost them in excess of 300 million because of all the challenges I've just stated. Machinery will have to be imported, steel and other inputs will have to be imported, crippling shipping costs, contractors will have to be imported, critical technical capacity may also have to be imported. So to achieve the same outcome as Indonesia, Solomon Islands will need to probably borrow or spend about 2 to 3 times more from its domestic resources. Yet, Indonesia and Solomon Islands will borrow almost at the same cost. So this is actually the start of what I call a food chain of unfairness. This chain of unfairness is written across the international development system. A crucial determinant of the cost of development finance is the cost of borrowing. The cost of borrowing is largely dependent on debt to GDP ratios. We obviously have had concessional financing, and that has gone a long way to help Fiji and other Pacific Island countries. And let me just also explain how debt to GDP ratios end up being high in small island states. I mean, Fiji is probably a larger economy, but a single investment in a small island country may be enough to cause debt stress. And I want to give you an example of Tuvalu. Tuvalu is currently borrowing about $20 million USD to upgrade its airport. The airport has been degraded as a consequence of climate change. 20 million USD in Tuvalu is nearly 33% of its total GDP. No one can argue that this is not a necessary and that this is a very crucial development for Tuvalu, because upgrading the airport will allow Tuvalu to keep connected to the Pacific, to the world, and in fact, it is an economic lifeline to the island states. But on the same token, if one can imagine, if Australia were to build a single airport worth $500 billion US out of a 1.5 trillion GDP economy, you can imagine, Australia probably would never sign off on a loan like that. Over so many years, Professor Vadan Narsi and I and many others have interacted with many American, Australian, and international scholars and policy makers, and we find them to be very experienced. But it still sometimes is very difficult for many of them to grasp and make sense of some of these numbers. Yet, as small island states, we are expected to be able to undertake these types of essential investments time and again, keep our economies afloat, keep our countries connected to other economies and societies to remain vibrant. And that is why we are saying this, and I said this during the World Bank ADB meeting, that something has to change. Something has to give. Business as usual could be a death sentence for small states in the future. And let me also comment on the enormous impact of geopolitics on our world. The burden of high commodity prices triggered by the Russia-Ukraine crisis, supply chain disruptions, have severe consequences for small island states. And this is obvious to families, individuals throughout the Pacific. Each morning when they buy a loaf of bread, the price of flour, for example, has increased by over 30% in our region. It has more than doubled in some countries. A loaf of bread costs anywhere between 50 to 100% more in Port Moresby, Port Vila, and Rarotonga. And as a region, we do not import a single grain of wheat from Ukraine or from Russia. However, we are all feeling the impacts of geopolitical tensions each time these families, individuals buy bread. And sadly, we are not distant islands shielded from the universe of geopolitical tensions. And geopolitical tensions have immediate impacts on small states of the Pacific. Finally, some of us, especially here in Fiji, are currently going through a major skill migration. In fact, in the last 18 months, we lost about 10% of our labor force. And this has the potential to harm our fragile post-pandemic progress. And I think we need to rethink how to rebuild the human resource infrastructure across the Pacific. And I've said this before. In fact, for the first time on the agenda of the regional finance ministers meeting, we talked about a fully integrated Pacific region. We talked about a visa-free arrangement as a crucial part to fix the movement of people, capital, ideas, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And this can't be a short-term, or this can't be a long-term goal. This has to be a short-term goal. Because in the long term, we would be facing a lot of these. So, my friends, ladies and gentlemen, these are some of the aspects of the new realities that we need to grapple with. It is time to recalibrate and re-strategize to adapt to this new normal. Some of the trainings, economists and development practitioners we have acquired over long period of time perhaps are not relevant. You know, I myself, I find that good politics is not necessarily good economics or good policy. And you have to constantly revise and re-look at what you wrote in the past and what you think are important at the moment. And as an academic and researcher, one has to always look for new ideas to build our knowledge and to sharpen our responses. But, you know, the positive side is this, that history has shown that when pressed, humanity has always been able to find solutions. You know, you can talk about, you know, inventing light to overcome darkness, vaccines to fight pandemics. We formed the International World Order with the United Nations at its heart to forge and maintain peace. And I think it is time again, and as I said, this is an inflection point for our region and indeed for the world. It is time for new energy. It is time to carve new pathways forward, and this is the time for creativity and innovation. As Finance Minister, I know that more of the same will be the surest path to economic and political disaster in Fiji and in the region. And again, as a researcher and academic in the past, I also know that at times like this, academics, researchers, scholars like yourselves, practitioners, you are at the finest. You know, this is an opportunity to come up with ideas. And this is not a time to shy away and concentrate on some modeling and writing, you know, papers in A-rank or A-star journals. It is time to come out you know, and do the sort of work that Professor Wadan Narsi has done for many years in Fiji and in the Pacific. And as a government, we want to foster an environment of open and constructive discussions. As a government, we've started very well. We are open to ideas. We're welcome to criticism, informed by critical thinking, because we believe that that is the best way to bring new ideas and innovation. And as a government, we seek your partnership to co-create solutions. We had a very successful National Economic Summit. We appointed a physical review committee, and some of the work done by those individuals from the private sector, academia, NGOs, is actually transformational. Fantastic ideas. And our focus now has to be on solutions. And I know that many of you are aware of the unique context of Pacific Island economies. You also know that it is diverse, and the Pacific is always welcoming of new ideas. And I think it is important that academics, researchers, development partners make Pacific or see Pacific as a region for testing new ideas as well, your new approaches, and scaling your policy and program innovations. So I want to express once again my sincere gratitude to the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank Institute. Dean, thank you very much, and the University of the South Pacific for collaborating to bring this forum to fruition. I think your commitment to supporting Pacific Island countries in the pursuit of sustainable economic development is commendable. And I know that you will have 2 very fruitful days, or 3, and I wish you all the best.